All right, I think we should start our final panel here at the WINIR conference. Let me first say that I really appreciate that all the three keynote speakers have come back to this final session to consider some of the themes, again, that have been influencing all the different panels that we've had, but of course were core to the three keynotes they gave. So Liz Baldwin was first, and then Harini Nagendra, and then Tine Moor. I learned that they were not able necessarily to listen to their respective keynotes. And while the big question that we really want to ask tonight is how polycentric governance might contribute to the challenges that we face in the 21st century. To answer this question, of course, we have to have a sense again how the different speakers understand polycentric governance, and while there was some overlap, I think there were also some important differences. And rather than trying to summarize them myself, since I have you all here, I just appreciate if we just go maybe in the order in which you spoke, and you just say in 2 minutes, maybe 3, but just very crisply, what your conceptualization of polycentric governance is, and then I'll ask you to also comment on the bigger question. But Liz, would you mind just stating your conceptualization of polycentric governance? Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, I'd be happy to. So my conceptualization really goes back to Ostrom, Thibault, and Warren, and sees polycentric governance as systems that include multiple centers of decision-making with overlapping authority that leads to interdependence, diverse arrangements for coordination between them that include cooperation, conflict, competition, conflict resolution. I would also add coercion, which I think maybe a lot of people in polycentric governance would not, but I would personally. And then maybe a few things that my conceptualization, I would say maybe recognizes, but doesn't quite include. And one is this assumption that polycentric governance always originates bottom up. For me, I think this is an interesting question to explore. I wouldn't necessarily include it as being part of the definition, but I think that may be a definitional thing. It's an important theme, maybe not a definitional theme. And the other is the assumption that if you have all of these ingredients, automatically things are going to be excellent. For me, that's an empirical question. And I think sometimes with polycentricity, we blur the lines between how we define things and what are empirical questions. And, you know, it's all quite interesting. I think I'll stop there.
Terrific. That's, I think, exactly what I wanted to hear, just very sort of concise, and so we know where you come from. And then when you apply this to the big questions, and you can also say a little bit more later on what the big topics are that you have applied your conceptualization to. But Harini, why don't you just give us your take as well?
Sure. So a lot of it matches with Liz, and I will not repeat that. But what I will add as an ecologist is I've been very influenced by Allen and Starr's very fundamental book called Hierarchy Theory, which talks about nested and non-nested hierarchies. So to me, polycentric governance, when I think of it very fundamentally, is how do I contrast it with monocentric governance, which seems to be the form that many planners talk about, whether in cities or forests, you know, what Lynn Ostrom called the blueprint approach. And what Allen and Starr speak of when they talk of hierarchy theory is that you need to go to, it's if you're studying a level, let's say it's urban governance, which I study most often these days, you need to go to the level above and the level below to really understand what's going on with the level that you're interested in. And so that is something that I add on to the idea of polycentric governance. Very clearly in India, urban governance is very polycentric, and I'll speak about this when we come back to how I use these ideas. But also very clearly in India, it's not polycentric because it's bottom up. It's far from that. In fact, it's polycentric just often because it's chaos and there are multiple agencies doing multiple things. So it's polycentricity of a very different kind. So one of the things I am interested in is I think many of the cases where polycentricity have been applied are really global south, global north context. And how does that differ in global south context? And the third thing that I am very interested in understanding is how does space play a role in polycentricity? Because of course, in a completely different literature of geography and urban planning, polycentric urban governance is thought of as multiple spatial centers and not the way we think of it in institutional analysis. And there's some merit to adding the component of space in there because ecology, geography is the nature of the resource system, so many other things that come in and really shape what is possible or not possible. It's not just institutions. So I think I'm very interested in understanding how how reality, in the sense of polycentricity, governance as rules and norms. In that sense, I think of it as part of our imaginations, and then there's what you can loosely call reality in terms of the soil, the water, the topography, and all of that. And how do these two interface to really create the complexity that makes governance challenging?
Thank you. So this is, I think, sort of it relates to, but it's also maybe a variation on the theme, especially as you bring in the theory of hierarchy and you contrast it to monocentric governance. Tine, why don't you bring us to your conceptualization? Thank you.
I'm very happy I can come third, because I think what I would like to add very much connects to what Elizabeth and Harini were already mentioning. I would like to bring in three elements. First of all, it's a description of a dynamic system. I think the word dynamic is very important in this, because it indicates that there's a development. And I think the dynamism of the system itself is very closely connected to it being polycentric. It's not static, and the polycentricity has to do also with the movement of the nodes in the network, so to speak, that are developing. And connected to that dynamism is also, I think, the lack of authority. And I want to make the distinction here between authority and hierarchy. I think those are two different things. Authority in the sense that decision-making is not organized top-down. Both the emergence and the decision-making, again, I think two different things, are mainly bottom-up, although I wouldn't necessarily see that as a requirement to call a system polycentric, that it's been formed bottom-up. But in many cases, I think that's also what Elizabeth was saying, in many cases it is a feature of such systems. But what is essential, I think, is that the authority is not central, but is distributed over the nodes of the system. So that two things are dynamic, lack of central authority, and then a third issue has to do, I think, with the element of space that Harini just brought in, whereby the connections between the nodes of the network are not necessarily spatially defined, but are more problem-oriented defined, in the sense that if centers within the network connect to each other, that is usually done on the basis of the recognition of a mutual problem, rather than it being connected to a ecological or a spatial similarity. Although, of course, if you're looking at the connection with ecology, simply the fact that ecology is, of course, also spatially defined or limited in many cases, I think there can be a clear spatial aspect in it as well, but not necessarily. I'm thinking also of the question that David put in front of us as a more general question. I think in my own talk, that's also how I would connect polycentricity to the developments I was describing myself. Well, that's it.
Thank you. So there's already, I think, an interesting theme here. One is sort of the relationship of hierarchy, authority to coercion. And the second theme is, I think, the relationship of different, let me call it jurisdiction, because I'm a lawyer. So different, not necessarily physical, spatial configurations, but different configurations, whereas space is sort of is an added, or maybe an alternative. I had a conversation with an urban planner at some point, and we at some point discovered that lawyers think always about jurisdiction, and the urban planners and architects think about maps. But these are different types of maps. I think there are different types of maps, and you can make multiple layers on top of each other. So maybe I'm not sure it's so fruitful to go into this too much. Maybe we can come back to the question of what is the role of hierarchy, authority, and also coercion in polycentric governance, because that might also relate to the big question: is what are the major challenges that we face in the 21st century, and what is the power of polycentric governance? Here we can also understand it as explanatory power. When we observe polycentric governance, however we understand them, what are they contributing to the problem solving that we see, but also how could we maybe expand polycentric governance to resolve the kind of problems that we face. So I would, maybe we just go in the opposite order, and then after that, Harini, you go first. So, always sort of squeeze in the middle. But maybe, Tina, maybe you can just jump off from what you just started and said, I relate my concept to what I'm doing, and you say a little bit more about what you're doing, but also how you think about these issues as relating to the major challenges that we face in the 21st century.
Yes, thank you. Yes, I think, well, polycentricity, well, as I described it in or at least I connected the concept to development I currently see in Europe, whereby many bottom-up organizations are currently developing networks, mainly within sectors, but also across sectors on the basis of their governance model itself. I think that there is a clear, I recognize clearly polycentricity in that movement. And I think whether it's the organizations that are central to the formation of this polycentric system are indeed formed bottom up. I'm not sure if the movement itself is always steered bottom up, because at some point you do see some forms of organizations emerging that have one way or another some form of, are more hierarchical, but that do not necessarily have authority over the organizations that they represent. It's mainly a sort of system of representation at the moment among these commons or institutional collective action across Europe. So what I see on the one hand, and I think we have to be very careful here about cause and consequence, whether we don't confuse them. But what I see happening right now is that many of these organizations are formed on the basis of a need to come up with a solution for a very local but often globally experienced problem. For example, climate change. Energy cooperatives are a very clear example of such organizations that are formed by citizens who see the need to act against climate change and set up their own energy cooperatives, and as such do so and decide not to get a contract with a commercial provider. So they do take a risk, and they take a risk to change, basically to tackle on the one hand their own needs, being a desire for a need for energy, but on the other hand also a desire to contribute to solving climate change. So I think from the citizen perspective in that case, there's definitely a potential there to contribute to major challenges. On the other hand, the networks themselves that develop and that represent these smaller organizations, they also do focus often on global challenges, but often they do develop into the lobby groups, and that was one of the issues I tried to mention in my talk, that there's some power relations there that are developing and that do cause some concerns. I was talking in my talk also about a platform that we've been setting up over the past few years for stakeholders involved in this wider movement of new institutions for collective action. And when I look at all the talks we had with all the stakeholders, the highest or the most competition between stakeholders within the same stakeholder group, whether it was civil servants or financiers or the network representatives of these networks, like from energy and care cooperatives and others, I felt the most competition between those representing those organizations. So I think there might be in due time also, instead of cooperation, also more competition between representatives of networks of these organizations that really started from a cooperative perspective. It shouldn't be like it probably, but it's something we experience, that they see each other sometimes also as competitors rather than potential collaborators. So I think there's on the one hand a huge potential, especially seen from the motivations of citizens to join such new commons, so to speak, and they do so out of motivations to really tackle 21st century challenges. On the other hand, there might also be increasing competition between those that represent them in this polycentric network that actually prevents them from really tackling those on a higher scale.
Okay. So if I can just briefly summarize, one is sort of you're describing a relatively spontaneous evolution in Europe, which can be described as a pluralization of organizational form in social action. And that is very often using a co-opt kind of style, but it's related to multiple actors. That I think makes it then in the end polycentric. But it's not clear yet whether this actually does lead us to tackle our major issues, whether there's social inequity or climate change or something effectively. But we do see a move away from monocentric forms of governance. And I think the process that you described for Europe is one that happens on its own. I think when we turn to the global south, which Harini talks about, and I think also Elizabeth in her work in Kenya, et cetera, has addressed, there might be different stories here. And I think so maybe the question that we should be asking is not only how does polycentric governance achieve certain things? But I'm learning from the way Liz has taught us how to ask questions, but also when does it, under what conditions does it, and what then also exactly are we looking for? Are we looking for adaptivity, something like that? But Harini, if you want to,
can I just add one small thing? I think we also need to think about. I mean, we see polycentricity may be a solution, but there might also be a dark side to it, because when we have new nodes connecting to each other, there might also be reasons to compete, and I think we're often overlooking that.
Yeah, it's not benign just because it's not the same that we had before, right? Yeah, we have to take a closer look. Harini, please.
I'll start with, I think, jumping off from something you said, Katharina, about maps. And as someone who uses maps a lot, one of the things I found with you, so I've looked at polycentric governance now in forests and cities, and now beginning to look at it in climate change. What I find is one of it's very hard to categorize, but you really need mixed methods. And so I found the use of remote sensing and GIS coupled with data on ecology and biodiversity, which is more quantitative, one being more spatial, one being more quantitative, and then the interviews with people to understand why they do what they do, how do they feel, what do they feel they're part of, and what do they feel they're not part of, and how do they navigate polycentricity. So to me, one of the big learnings has been that really to understand polycentricity, each time I use a new method, and I'm still learning, whether it's history or whatever it is, I find a new slice, a new layer, a new aspect of the complexity that I've missed, and that seems to be informing me in what directions to go next. So to me, that's been sort of one big learning of let's say 30 years of doing this in different systems. But what I think, so where do I start? I think I'm not going to take all three cases, but I will take the city, because Bangalore is right now in the midst of one of the worst floods. It's had the heaviest rains that we've ever experienced since the record of rainfall for an entire year has existed. And it's been extraordinary. The area that I am on, especially, so many of my friends and colleagues have been flooded out of homes and living elsewhere. We're fortunate to be in a slightly higher elevation, so we're okay. But I really was telling David that I'm not sure whether the rain gods will allow me to continue to actually make this presentation, because it's been very bad. And it's still very bad. Many people can't go back to their homes for 2 weeks. So what does polycentricity tell us? It's very interesting listening to the media discuss the challenges, and the politicians discuss this, and the Twitter discussions, and the WhatsApp discussions. And of course, now there are multiple for the citizen groups. And what they have in common is a very monocentric view of somebody else to blame. And I think this is something we're going to see in all contexts, not just the global south context. We see it in the US, for instance, even in just the media discussions. Who's to blame? So the politicians might say the previous party in governance was to blame. The communities which are getting swamped will say, the one next door was to blame, and someone else will say, no, I didn't do it, it's the real estate lobby. So all this blame game is very fascinating, but basically no one wants to take responsibility. And so to me, this is the dark side of polycentricity, which really you see here, which is this. So let's take, a big part of why Bangalore floods is it was a city of lakes, and now the lakes have been built over. Why have they been built over, and how do you restore it? Also using a different hat, and again, mixed methods, transdisciplinarity has taught me a lot about polycentricity. As an academic studying it, I think these were concepts in the abstract, but once I started working on lake governance as a community resident and helping activist groups and trying to use my science to drive action, what I find there is that it's a very confusing thing. Let's say you're a community trying to restore a lake. Your lake is owned by the municipality. The sewerage systems that feed into the lake are owned by the sewerage board. The revenue department decides if there's encroachment or not. The fisheries department has licenses to give fishing contracts out, and that's very important because the fisherman is an important ally. The police are involved if a fence is broken. The pollution control board comes in if someone's dumping waste. And so unless you get this, you really get bounced around. And this is the case of group after group which wants to restore their lakes. I know a group which wanted to work on a lake, and for 7 years, they were sent from department to department because nobody would tell them who owned the lake. You know, everyone said, I didn't own the lake. And then they came back to the first department and it turned out they owned the lake, but just didn't want to tell them because they didn't want to take responsibility. And this happens all the time. Right? So polycentric governance, the dark side of it is really who's going to take responsibility. And I think as Lynn and I wrote in a paper on polycentric governance of forests, boundary conditions to me become very important. On the other hand, polycentric governance has a good side. And the good side is you can often figure out you just keep going from department to department as a group, as community, you know, when I say you, it's community groups wanting to restore a lake, till you find the department with an officer who's listening to you, who's actually wants to do something. And typically they have some powers because the boundary conditions are so ill-defined that someone can take the power on them in their hands to do something. And you'll always find somebody, you know, you go to 5 departments, you'll find someone who's receptive and someone wants to make a change. And that's how things move. So there is a good side and there's a bad side. But moving forward, I think as a city, if we have to fix this, there's multiple things we have to fix. We have to fix the roads. We have to fix the public transports because the roads that keep getting widened are all on the waterways. You can't fix the climate change because that's another polycentric problem and you're not going to be able to fix that. But you have to fix the wetlands, which means you have to fix the planning department. And you're not going to fix any of this unless you know the boundary conditions and you know when to make the switch. So who's responsible for lake governance? It's also the community because at night and during the day also they're the people at that lake. But then if there are certain kinds of problems, they need to escalate this to the municipality. There's certain other kinds of problems like pollution, they need to escalate it to the pollution control board. And what we lacked is a really well-defined, well-articulated set. Let's not even get defined. Let's not even talk about legality, but a well-articulated set of boundary conditions that say who under what conditions does what and should do what. And unless we have that, I think it's really clear in the entire narrative that I've been reading over the past 2 weeks that no one has a clue, because otherwise it's easy to rage and do social media warrior rages about corruption or about bad planning, but it's not going to fix anything. Right? So yeah, this is where I'm thinking, you know, 50% of the world is urban. It's going to become 75-80% urban soon. And all that 30-40% of the urban has to be built and in the global south and will land up in contexts like this. So I think this is a really important problem.
Before I turn this to Liz, let me just throw out here that it seems like polycentricity by definition has multiple overlapping boundaries that are not clearly hierarchical. So there's always sort of some degree of ambiguity. And at the same time, you're saying polycentric governance to solve problems can work only if we have relatively clear boundary definitions. Otherwise, we can't coordinate, right?
Yes.
However,
the fact that it's a hard hierarchical system to study because it's a non-nested hierarchy.
Yes. Okay.
And nested hierarchies are conceptually easy to study, but non-nested hierarchies with spatial overlaps that change depending on context and time of year and time of day and condition are very complex.
Yeah. Okay, Elizabeth. Thank you.
Yeah, great. Wow. I'm just thinking so many things hearing what Tine and Harini have both said, but for me, one of the reasons that I find polycentricity to be an enduring concept is because when I look at the kinds of problems that I study, they resemble exactly what Harini is talking about. They are complex in ways that are difficult to describe. And I don't know about everybody else in the room, but I feel like many of the old models that we were taught in political science or in public administration just are inadequate for describing this more complex reality. I I teach students in an MPA program theories of the policy process, and I'm sometimes at a loss for how to teach them, because we have this old political science view that is changing, but it's this idea the state is central, the state is one actor. The state is not often described in the variation that Harini just described. You've got lots of different elements of the state interacting in different ways. And I think this idea that the state is the primary actor, it's the primary decision maker, it is the public goods provider and the regulator and the enforcer, it just doesn't really describe what we actually see often in the world. Whether we're talking about the global north or the global south, we see a lot of departure from those models, maybe in slightly different ways, that are just not well described. I think Vincent Ostrom wrote about this a little bit in the context of public administration and the intellectual crisis in public administration, which I think was published in 1975, where he said, you know, you guys, you only think of the public agency as the primary actor, but there are so many other actors. And you know, the discipline is now cut up a little bit by talking about network governance and creating network governance models. But I think if you assume, and Tina hinted at this a little bit, they tend to kind of assume cooperation, and maybe network models haven't quite yet adapted to recognizing that there's a lot happening that's not cooperation. And for me, polycentricity gives a language for describing these things. I think the other thing that's going on in the 21st century is environmental problems are front and center. And many of them have this particular feature that the people who are experiencing the problems are at the local level. So the people who have the best knowledge about how problems are playing out are inherently local. Sometimes the people who are causing the problems are not exactly the same as the people experiencing the problems, right? So the people causing the problems may be local, they may not be local, they may emerge from different ways, they may be private sector, they may be governmental actors, there's a lot of complexity there. And then often the people who have the kind of scientific information that you need to aggregate local knowledge and make sense of it and model it and use it with precision, they may exist at yet another governance level. And so managing all these things, we have to bring together these different forms of knowledge and different behaviors. And I think polycentricity, it gives us a language for understanding that that's really important. It also, this is just a quick comment, but about the Global South, I'm somebody who does research both in the US and in Sub-Saharan Africa. And again, there's a lot going on sometimes in the Global South that is not well described by my political science colleagues when you think about customary authority and traditional ways of doing things. It's really nice to, if we talk about decision centers rather than government agencies, that leaves us open to the possibility that the way people resolve problems can vary quite a lot across context, and not to kind of ignore the way things actually work, because we're Western scientists who were trained in sort of Western ways of thinking. And then just to kind of bring it back to what I'm doing and how I've played this out, I have too many projects, and that's a big problem for me, but I can contrast two that illustrate this. One is the Kenyan case, and this is explicitly polycentric. That was a system of governance that was initiated in part by somebody who read Elinor Ostrom's work. He had also observed on the ground efforts to resolve conflicts over water use that involved government actors and resource users and nonprofit organizations. And he kind of said, let's make this be more systematized, and created this polycentric structure where local decision-making is happening, and it's largely supported by higher levels of government. And we studied that, and it was really interesting. The thing that is closer to home for me now, you can kind of see in my background, I'm here in the Sonoran Desert. It is a spectacular ecosystem that is deeply threatened by an invasive grass, actually an invasive grass from Africa, that operates in a really different way. It evolved ecologically under really different conditions, and it's going to come here and displace our beloved saguaro cactus. And I don't know if I can say that our system for governance to address this invasive grass is polycentric. I guess it is. It's not even a system. It's like this thing has been around for about 30 years, and we're still trying to grapple with how we deal with it, and the state doesn't have proper authority or responsibility to do it. And there's lots of action on the ground. It hasn't yet quite evolved into a governance system. And I don't know exactly how I'll be applying the concepts of polycentricity to this emerging case, but I guess I'm seeing people on the ground trying to solve problems, trying to develop institutions. And the old models of political science just are utterly inadequate for helping me think about who is actually involved, what are they doing on this, how do they interact with each other, how does that change and evolve and adapt over time. So while it would be premature for me to say we're doing this in a polycentric way, I still find these concepts to be useful as I sit down and interview people and try to make sense of what does this governance system look like and how might I observe as it changes and evolves over time.
So I think what I'm hearing a lot is that polycentricity helps us to describe complex responses and problem-solving approaches in different types of contexts that have certain types of characteristics which we defined earlier. What we don't quite know yet, and maybe some of that is just, do we have enough time, data over time, etc. But what we don't quite know yet is how effective it is in even solving local problems, or under what conditions they are effective in solving local conditions, much less global ones. But what I would like to do is actually encourage all of you to maybe respond to each other rather than me just mediating. So I would give maybe Harini the first cut at maybe responding to what the other two keynote speakers have said, or expanding on what you said earlier, with some of the bigger themes in mind. Is it descriptive? Is it normative? Can we derive some major lessons about polycentricity as a governance regime that might be more or less adaptable, which is one of the questions that Liz had asked, or more or less effective in solving problems with indigenous people or in urban settings? But you can also choose your own take on what the others have said. Harini.
So to me, polycentricity is both an analytical and a practical or pragmatic lens. And pragmatically, I think it's very useful to think of how should a city fix its problems, or how should any system fix its crises, and climate change, being another one. But that does not mean that the solutions it provides are necessarily going to be used by people, because I think there are very sound reasons and often political, economic reasons why things don't happen in a certain way and don't align in a certain way. But I think it's an analytic lens that's very useful, not just with writing papers, but trying to think out. Often when you tell people and when you communicate to people using the language of polycentricity, but explaining what each of those means, I think they really get it in terms of why is it, because otherwise people say, why is it that we can't fix this problem? Because there are all of these little things that come in. And the other lens people often use while talking about climate change or environmental problems is the wicked lens. And I find that's also analytically useful, but it's not, and that comes to the normative that you're talking about. It's not as useful as polycentricity, because when you talk about wicked problems to people, it becomes overwhelming, even to students. It's like, oh, it's wicked, I can't do anything, it's a Gordian knot, I can't cut it, the world is doomed, I'm doomed. And especially when you're talking to young people about sustainability, I feel polycentricity is just much more powerful to use in classrooms or writing op-eds or things like that. Okay, now beyond that, I found both these discussions of the examples that Liz and Tine spoke of very interesting. I guess because I also come from a very different literature. I'm not a political scientist, and I've always come at this as an ecologist much more. I've talked to a lot of political scientists, but never, really done political science per se, or urban planning per se. But I think the European context is very fascinating. And if the visa gods, speaking of the ring, that the visa gods all align, then I'll be in Lewis University next year, spending 6 weeks trying to look at the urban system, some of the systems Tina was talking about in Italy, and trying to see how this kind of self-organization has come up. I'm fascinated to do that, because I think that is a completely different context. I haven't seen that kind of vibrant emergence of city-based commons revival anywhere else except in Europe. And I'm really very interested in seeing how that will work. I have and invasive species, Liz, I'm very curious about knowing how this works much more in practice, because I have seen that there are a lot of invasive species challenges in India, which are polycentric by nature, and you're right, they're not acknowledged as such. But I have a question for both of you, if I can. Do you find over your own several decades of looking at these problems, and maybe Katharina too, how do you find using mixed methods has helped? And how do you find looking at multiple contexts has helped? What do those sharpen? So for instance, I think if I had looked at cities first before looking at forests, I wouldn't have found the differences that now hit me so strongly, because I'm from a city, I was reading this parable today about a fish swimming in water and asking another fish, how's the water? And the fish says, what's the water? Because you're in the water, right? And so I think to me, these cases really help, but I'm very curious to know from all of you.
Yeah, maybe Tina, you want to go first?
Sure, yeah, well, maybe first responding to your last question, Harini, to what extent mixed methods and different contexts helped. Well, I'm by training an environmental scientist and historian, and I really have, I think, well, in all honesty, learned most from my historical side, in the sense that it also allows you to compare same locations with different contexts throughout time. And it's exactly there, I think, that I learned that not every attempt to scale collective action or initiatives of collective action necessarily leads to a polycentric result. And that has to do, to some extent, I think, with the context. I'll say a bit more about that later on. And to what extent mixed methods has helped, definitely. As far as you could consider the historical approach as a different method, I don't think so. We borrow a lot of methods from the social sciences more in general. But I think I've, myself used many different methods, all the way to agent-based modeling as well, which very surprisingly, really, I mean, in all honesty, I was not convinced myself that it would lead to any interesting results, but it did very much so. So it's definitely something to explore further in the future, although many historians probably would disagree with using that method on historical data. But having said that, I was typing also during listening to both of you. When I try to explain polycentricity to both lay people and academics, and also academics, even in policy analysis, etc., then I do find it difficult to say what exactly is it. An analysis method? Is it an analysis lens? Is it a description of a system? I think it would rather be the last. And for me, maybe that has to do, I'm a bit biased as a historian maybe, but it has to do that very definitely with the evolution of how decision-making centers evolve. And I see it as a result of a scaling strategy very much so. That's maybe because when I was comparing scaling strategies of institutional collective action over time, that's where polycentricity showed to me as being the most, well, as a distinctive feature in comparison to the other contexts which were in the past, the historical ones. I've tried to explain that in my talk. I think the best way to figure out what polycentricity really stands for is by looking at the alternatives and by trying to describe also the alternatives and see what the consequences are of the alternatives. And when I looked at the evolution of commons, and as a side note, very resilient commons as individual institutions in the early modern period, and the commons we looked at in both in cities and the countryside, they were extremely resilient. They survived many centuries in many cases. So they were capable of dealing with many periods of ecological stress, etc. But the fact that they were so independent and basically functioning next to each other without any central coordination, so no type of polycentricity there, no units that are being connected to each other, that was their vulnerable point. And that also led to a very quick demise of the whole movement, as far as you could call it a movement, in fact, because they were not working together. And the second wave of institutional collective action I described, which was mainly centered around the turn of the century from the 19th to the 20th century, they chose a completely different strategy by basically doing the opposite, more or less, by not working together, but actually becoming one, by merging, yeah? Which then again has a very negative effect on the individual motivations of members, because the distance between their own right to decide and the central decision-making unit the distance is becoming extremely large. In that sense, I'm actually quite optimistic with the developments that you see currently in Europe, because they seem to find a midway in between letting go of the, so not searching for the merger strategy, but on the other hand, going for cooperation through networks, and as such achieving scaling. I think every organization that is successful from the beginning will have the tendency to scale in one way or another. And in some cases, you see periods, you see contexts which lead to scaling up, others periods in scaling out. I think comparing that over time or over different contexts, and I'd love to do this also in other regions in the global south and see what happens there. I think that can teach us a lot about the conditions under which polycentricity emerge. And one side note also, I mean, this is maybe quite particular to the current context of Europe, but I also always like to refer to the fact that most of our knowledge about polycentricity and about commons in general, I mean, that's the topic I usually work on, is really based on knowledge that was gathered and data that was gathered in the global south to a very large extent. And we seem to forget that often. So I think we have to highlight that more frequently, but also, I mean, in Europe right now, this whole movement is seen as something, you know, revolutionary. It's going to change things. It's going to challenge governments and going to turn, you know, decision-making a bit upside down, according to some. Well, in many global south countries, there is still at least a part of that polycentricity is still present. So maybe that's also a reason that helps us to explain why, you know, if you don't have it anymore, then it looks more revolutionary. And if you still have a sort of basis, then it's maybe less revolutionary at first sight, but it's still there.
Great. Liz, thank you.
Yeah, so much to respond to. This is really fun. So thank you to the organizers for setting it up. I can't respond to everything, so I'll just pick and choose a little bit. But I think one thing I would like to respond to what Tina was saying, or maybe amplify what she was saying. And this is something fun, I think, about having somebody who comes at this from a historical perspective, which a lot of empirical researchers do not, is the importance of adaptation over time, right? Which I think my lit review suggests. We know conceptually that adaptation over time is central, but empirically we get these grants to study systems for 3 to 5 years. And then if we still have the motivation and the desire and the ability to get more money, maybe we'll come back and look at it later. So I think our knowledge of polycentricity is a little bit truncated because we don't always take the longer historic perspective that I think we should, and we should start thinking more creatively about how, you know, how can we do that with our existing methods, or what methods do we need to bring in to expand that. And I'll just add about the US context, again, to piggyback on what Tina was saying. I think we used to be much more polycentric than we were. Alexis de Tocqueville, you know, came hundreds of years ago saying, wow, you Americans, man, when you face a problem, you get together with your neighbors and you try to solve it. And I feel like right now, the discourse, it's like we're looking at the federal government to solve problems that the federal government is not going to solve. They may shoot money at it. And that's probably the best that they're going to do for a lot of the things that we experience locally. And so I really wish that we would maybe look back a little bit to some of those more polycentric roots and be more open, because our, you know, it's about ultimately problem solving capability. And right now I don't look to Congress for being the nexus of problem solving capability in the same way that I might look to local communities to do that. So that I just want to amplify that. I think both of you have talked a little bit about potential dark sides, which I quite like hearing about, not because I'm not optimistic about polycentricity. I think it's probably the best problem-solving arrangement that we have, but we don't want to be blind to the fact that it might have dark sides. And again, I've been doing this literature review where few people, I think the literature has moved a little bit from saying, is this a good thing or is this a bad thing, to thinking about, well, how does it change what we do? Maybe it enhances our ability to solve problems, but at the expense of introducing a lot of transaction costs, making it a lot slower that we make decisions, or thinking about who's excluded, who sees things as legitimate. So, you know, there are trade-offs that are inherent not just to polycentricity as a concept, but also the way polycentricity plays out in a particular place. And maybe introducing some of that language about trade-offs. You know, I think about the pandemic, which I've been studying. You see really clear differences right now between the way China is handling the pandemic and the way the US is handling the pandemic. And, you know, there are trade-offs, right? If you want to have a disease-free location, you may accept more centralized control. If you want to have less centralized control, you may have more disease spread. And so that's a very crude example, but just to illustrate that there are trade-offs. I want to get back though to Harini's question about mixed methods and mixed contexts, because I think this is so critical. And you talked also a little bit about interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary. And I mean, I think that we all know that you can't really tackle these complex questions without having mixed methods and mixed disciplines, which also poses a challenge. I'll talk about that first, but then I'll move on. I have been doing a lot of research, interdisciplinary research, and one of the things that I have found that is a challenge is that what is considered at the forefront for one discipline may not always be super interesting in interdisciplinary context. And I'll give an example. In the Kenya work, we had a lot of hydrologists on the project, and they were like, yeah, it's super fun to go out in Kenya and rig up ways to try to assess how water is allocated in these community water projects, but this is never going to get me published in X journal. And, you know, so it's not an insurmountable challenge, but as I've done more of it, I've begun to think through, you know, when do you want to involve a graduate student in a project? You probably want to involve a graduate student in a project when they can be doing something that will be recognized in their discipline as a valuable contribution, which may not align 100% with the contribution that that discipline can make to your understanding of this particular problem. And, you know, again, I think that there are creative ways to overcome these challenges so that we do what's good for grad students and junior researchers and generating problem-solving knowledge. We've got the capability to do that, but we have to be kind of cognizant of it as we go forward. Mixed methods, yeah, 100%. I mean, I'm sort of mixed methods dyed in the wool, and I very much like the ability of qualitative methods to tell you what's going on, and the ability of quantitative methods to allow broader cross-case comparison and hypothesis testing. I've been dabbling a little bit in agent-based models, and Tina, I don't know if I'm fully convinced, but I get to have these great conversations now with a collaborator. I found a perfect collaborator who I would say, in my fantasy world, the agent-based model can do X, Y, and Z, and he'll think thoughtfully and he'll say, well, if I was going to do that, here's how I would proceed. And so I really do think that when you get these people that know what their method can do really well, and you get into a space where you can really share, then amazing things can happen. Obviously, we probably all have instances where that's not the case. But I think mixed methods are crucial. And then the last thing is mixed contexts. Wow. Yeah, Harini, I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head here. I've been thinking about this a lot because I study public administration, and increasingly many of my PhD students are from the Global South. And so I have a student studying public participation in government agencies in Thailand. And we've got lots of theories on public participation, but most of them were developed by US and European researchers in the US and European context. And it's kind of like we make this assumption that our theories and models are universal, and maybe aspects of them are universal, but other aspects, you know, there's probably a lot that's missing from those theories. And, you know, I think this is one of the reasons why I like studying in both sub-Saharan Africa and the US, because you can't just assume that things that work one way in one context work in other contexts. But I think that a lot of people who work only in one context aren't thinking about how does the context shape the way this plays out. If you only look at systems where property rights are well defined, you may not realize how critical that is to the way things have played out. And so sometimes I think, what am I doing? I have this eclectic portfolio, which can leave me kind of scattered sometimes, but on the other hand, it gives me this ability to compare across contexts that I don't think I would have if I wasn't saying, oh, energy, water, invasive species. You really begin to see, how does the nature of the problem affect the way it plays out? How does the nature of the context affect how it plays out? So yeah, I guess trade-offs.
Okay, there are also trade-offs between continuing our conversation amongst the three of us or the four of us, but I think I also wanted to give the audience a chance to raise questions that they might still have for you. I mean, they've poked you individually with questions, but I think this conversation has revealed some other aspects that haven't been discussed before. So I see David Gindis has raised his hand. If there are more, I would probably go and say, let's collect 2 or 3 questions and then go back to the panelists and have them respond. But David, why don't you give it a shot?
Yeah, thanks very much for this wonderful discussion. I think it was really, really useful to not only see what the commonalities and also differences between all your 3 kinds of lines of work are, but also I think to address a new set of questions, and this is coming across quite well in the discussion. I wanted to just ask you, if you will indulge me, to pick a grand challenge of the 21st century, whatever you decide. Migration, civic disaffection, privacy, the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, whatever. And what does polycentric governance help us? And of course, I know that it's not about panaceas, and obviously we've heard that there are dark sides and dilution of responsibilities and problems. And I wonder if there is an answer which is beyond, we need to be multilateral about these problems. What can we add to this conversation? It's kind of a tough question, I think, but it's, I think, an interesting one for the conference. Thank you.
Well, since it is a tough question, and there's another hand coming up, David. David, do you want to just add on to your question, and then we'll go back to the panel?
Yeah, thank you, Katharina, and thank you to the panel for a terrific conversation. So I guess I grew up in a context where the emphasis was on pluralism, and a pluralism contrasted with unitarism. But the idea of pluralism was, as I understand it, is an idea that recognizes that you can have what we're calling polycentric governance arrangements, but at the same time you have monocentric governance arrangements. And so it isn't about do you have either monocentric or polycentric. From a pluralist perspective, you need to have both. And the way in which they're configured will depend very much on situation-specific contingencies. So I just wonder what your thoughts are on that.
Okay, I guess back to the panelists. I take volunteers amongst you to tackle either question first, and then we'll go around.
You do challenge us for sure. I could, I think, try to answer something, try to respond to David's question. I think where polycentricity can make the difference is where the benefit of cooperation is influenced, and it's a difficult one to formulate, but is influencing the quality of the outcome of the cooperation versus situations whereby it is more about the quantity. And I explain myself. What I see when units of collective action, like the ones I described, work together, for example, energy cooperatives across Europe working together and exchanging knowledge and working, and forming a lobby center together, they improve the outcome of their own collective action. Their own organization improves in its functioning, in its resilience, by learning from other organizations. However, if we look at the way in which, on a country basis, the Corona crisis was challenged, surely there can be an improvement of learning, but the need to handle this fast and get a uniform behavior basically among citizens of the same country I think there's not necessarily a benefit in polycentricity, but in central coordination. Although, of course, there's degrees in that as well. I mean, for example, the way in which China is now employing central coordination is quite drastic. Now, at some point, which is actually an interesting afterthought I have now, at some point during the Corona crisis, there was an action in the Netherlands taken by a number of networks of citizens, active citizens. They wrote a letter to the Prime Minister in the Netherlands, reaching out to him and saying, look, we formed this network of many different organizations across the Netherlands, which are constantly in contact with citizens, people who are often hard to reach, people in poverty, but also, I mean, people active in the local care cooperative or agriculture or something like that. They wrote to the minister, I've seen the letter, they reached out and basically on a golden plate, they offered to use their polycentric network. It was a combination of organizations to deal with the Corona crisis and in particular to go against all the stories that were emerging about the vaccines, etc. The Prime Minister said, we don't need you. Literally, that's the response they got. We're dealing with this. We do this top down, and we basically don't want you to interfere with this. So there was such a clash there visible between the polycentric approach and the hierarchical approach. I personally think that maybe some of the issues could have been solved by, involving them. But on the other hand, you can question whether coordinating this with a polycentric approach would have worked because of the type of the problem they were trying to deal with. And I think there's a different, I mean, just as Lynn said, commons are not the panacea for all. I think polycentricity is not a panacea either. And you have to look first at the problem and the type of result you want to achieve as a society. And do you want to have good public transport? Well, there are several options for that. You can have it state governed, you can have it privatized. Maybe you can also look at the collective action solution. I would not do that. I think the most obvious solution for it is to do it on a state level basis and coordinate it from there. The private version hasn't worked that well either. I mean, UK has decided to renationalize their train network. So I think look at the problem, see what do you want to achieve quantity, do you want to achieve quality, and the way you set up your scaling mechanism, so to speak, and what is then the best solution to achieve it. That's how I would go technically and theoretically about it.
Other responses to either question or both?
I'd like to take a stab, but I find it is a fascinating question, and the first one, and a very hard one. I'm thinking of grand challenges like air pollution or let's say tree felling in cities in the Indian context. And I'm using both of these as examples of when the Indian state is pushed, is following a developmental agenda, and I'm using development in quotes because of course it's a model of development which is inspired by the market and economic growth. And so to do something about, let's say, air pollution, let's take that, or tree felling in cities for road expansion, is something that is impacting the quality of life of so many people. I mean, I think there are now papers, there's now research from the World Health Organization that says 10 years of life of a child born in a polluted city in India are going to be reduced in several cases because of air pollution. I can't think as a parent of why we're not out on the streets fighting for this, right? But yet we're not, because it's also a classic slow problem, because it's you're not in the fire, you're in the fire, but the temperature is increasing gradually, so you don't realize how bad it is. But what's the solution? I think polycentricity is one solution, because what happens is that the governments hear from the corporate groups, they hear from the market loud and clear. And they don't necessarily hear from the groups that want to fight things like, Mothers Against Air Pollution, which is a large group now gathering force. And there I find polycentricity being used in multiple ways. I know academic research, my own research, for instance, is being used by groups in Delhi or other places for court cases, for public interest litigations. And similarly, there are the excellent lawyers in Delhi preparing a list of what are the legal things that you can do in terms of your rights to challenge the court in many of these. And that's being used by activist groups across the country. So I think this networking that people realize that you need to come together to actually compel or impel, compel is a bad word, but maybe impel the government to act. And tell them that there's a constituency that demands this as much as they demand the markets and demand the economic growth, because you have to steer this ship to understand that this is a real crisis. Right? And so that to me is something that I see polycentricity very influential, and it reminds me of my earlier work in Nepal, because there was community forestry in Nepal and it was a pioneer. And then the government of Nepal realized that there was a lot of money in this community forestry. They were actually protecting forests which are timber rich, and then they were going to sell some of this timber and they were going to lose out on this money. So they came in with a lot of constraints and conditions saying, we want to have so much of the money, and then you can use the other money in this way, and you have to get permissions from us. And then they formed a federation at the next level called the Federation of Community Forestry Users of Nepal, FECOFAN. And that became a political force. And that even today, I was looking at an article very recently, last month, is still negotiating with the government saying you can't do these things because FECOFAN is against it. And the government will step back in many cases because of the political power that this federation now has. So I think that to me is very useful as an analytical approach. How do you actually get people to move away? And yeah, to respond to David Beach's, I think that's very interesting. I'm trying to think of what would be a monocentric government governance case in the Indian context. And I frankly can't think of anything. So I'd just seeing if you could define something for me.
Can I respond really quickly, Katharina? Yeah, so David, I think, you're both David. I think climate change is the 21st century challenge, and lots of people have written about polycentricity and climate change, and we've observed we had a much more centralized approach under the Kyoto Protocol that collapsed, much more polycentric approach under the Paris Agreement that it holds promise, right? Even if we haven't yet seen it play out, but it holds promise. So I think that that's the best example, and it also maybe responds a little bit to David's, question about pluralism. Obviously, addressing climate change, that's a pluralistic problem, but it includes the need, I think, for coercion. We can do a lot of things without coercion in polycentric governance, but ultimately to deal with climate change, we are not going to rein in the fossil fuel interests that have so much financial stuff at stake without governments imposing coercive limits as one of a larger package of incentives and cooperation and competition and things that happen outside the realm of the state. So for me, that's example number one.
Thank you. Nadia, please.
Yes, thank you. I wanted to ask a question that is maybe going around the polycentricity at the start, but would like to get there afterwards. So from this conference, right, we have seen that complexity in all of these situations, especially when it comes to environmental degradation and our quest, right, to mitigate climate change effects, is pervasive everywhere. And I'm, as a sort of interdisciplinary social scientist with also an economic background, I'm starting to think about something since some months now, that basically the fluidity concept of money may be actually the quickest way to diffuse in very complex and heterogeneous systems. So I'm starting to think about this. We've had this long debate about going beyond GDP, but I'm starting to think, what if we all use our collective power in our requests, right, against environmental degradation, to request a stronger accountability on natural capital, including an accountability of negative cultural capital. So, natural capital. So in the sense that if we have a pollution, if we have a degradation of an environment, that this is actually becoming a financial quantity that is measurable. So my question is, do you think that this would create synergies in a polycentric system, or would it be alienating? in the sense of would it help, or would it create other barriers to give a sort of a shock of quick diffusion, because we need something fast, right? We need fast solutions now at this stage. I'm not sure if my question was understandable. Was it understandable? Yes.
I think I could venture a response, because I've been thinking about this. I hang out with economists off and on. I think, yes, you're right. In a way, the thing with money is it can translate information into terms that are legible and that provide signals that guide behavior in ways that are both useful and sometimes counterproductive, right? So we've seen it be really powerful in both senses. I think the challenge for doing that in a polycentric way is who insists that money account for these problems. Oh, did we? Oh no, you're still there. Who insists on this? And I mean, in the US, we've had a lot of different attempts to try to quantify and build into models of decision-making the financial impacts of future generations. And even within the discipline of economics, we have these fights over what's the appropriate discount rate, how do you measure it accurately, and actually very few government agencies, very few markets actually incorporate that component of information into financial signals. And so I think the question for a polycentric system is, who forces our markets to include those components of prices, because we're not going to do it on our own. And how does that play out? Does that play out in a way that seems overly coercive, or is that kind of an acceptable amount of coercion for somebody to say, money reflects these particular costs, markets reflect these particular costs, now you use that as information. So I think that would be a tension that would have to be resolved. And at least in the US, I don't see people politically getting behind this, but it could be amazing if they did.
Yeah, I think I would add to that we also have created a lot of barriers to polycentricity in this context. I mean, just think of limited liability. It basically means that you can pollute without the investors facing any kind of responsibility. And as long as that is in place, the allocation of responsibility and the money as a real signal is impeded. And so I think if we think of the lens of polycentricity and look back to the systems that we have created to allocate the powers that we currently confront and are trying to tackle with polycentricity, there's probably also some research to be done to think of how much they're insulated from having to coordinate with others or having to share costs, and therefore also being forced to coordinate because of the institutional choices that were made long ago. But I didn't want to prevent the other two panelists to respond from responding to Nadia's question. So Tine or Harini, do you have a response to that as well? Question of money.
I'm still digesting the question, so not sure I already have an answer. It's quite a complex one. I think we are actually, I mean, to a large extent, like tradable emission rights, etc., are a new internationally sort of coordinated system to monetize, pollution to some extent. If you look at it, you could also say it is a sort of polycentric system, but because it's in the hands of the market, and the market is left to develop it, and there is some sort of central coordination, but it is in many cases abused as well. So I'm not sure where this is going, but I don't think, I'm not sure if that it could be a solution for problems like that.
I'm wondering if carbon taxes are aligned to what you're thinking of, and I'm not sure if it is, because I know that several economists in India have been warning, for instance, of Europe is at some point, I think, going to impose carbon taxes, and countries like India and China will get hit by those. And so what that is going to do, we don't know. Is that going to be positive? Is that going to be negative? Is that what are the ethical normative implications of that, when especially given the historical dimensions of carbon inequity in terms of emissions? We don't know. So there's a lot in that, just imposing an externality cost on countries that have not yet reached one path of development growth? I don't know. But on the other hand, does that mean that every country follows the same path of development growth? Clearly, we can't afford that as a planet, whatever the normative rights of that are. So there's a lot that one needs to discuss here.
Sorry, Katharina, can I just briefly react on these replies? What I had in mind is really, because I think the emission system is not sufficient. I'm thinking really about an accountability issue, about a way to make things appear that right now are not appearing in numbers, which is the measure of the natural capital. And even if let's ignore the intergenerational problem, which is already huge, right? But let's just start with what we have today, find a way to measure it, and then start applying deltas. Are we deteriorating every year a little bit, or are we restoring every year a little bit of this? So I'm just thinking, what if we found a way to actually just measure the status quo and its degradation? I'm pretty sure that ecologists would be able to find a way to proxy that. And as a sort of global environmentalist request, right? We have so many, let's try to converge on this single thing that we actually measure, the health of the natural capital.
But don't we already measure a lot of these issues, and what kind of effect do they have? I mean, the number, the amount of ice that's left, to mention one part on the poles is measured. We know that it's declining. There's constant information, updated information, but it's not getting any better in terms of prospects on climate change. There's a lot of data out there, and apparently it's not making that impact. So I'm not sure if.
But it's not monetized. It's not monetized in a single way.
I think it often is. It often is. The impact, the economic impact of climate change is constantly recalculated, and the effect, the potential effects are well known, no? Also economically.
But imagine if
So we have only 1 minute left, and I just wanted to just give a voice to someone else. Massimo had a very interesting comment in the chat. Maybe you want to just unmute and tell us what your concern was about generalizing the big debate, essentially, Massimo.
Sure, thank you. So that was about the general public having more of a sense of polycentricity. Yeah, so I think I read somewhere either about polycentricity or the Commons about that it's become a term that's well known now. But I know before I joined this conference, I had never heard of it. And in the talks that I've heard, I've been inspired beyond what I can say. So I wonder what a difference it would make if more of the general public had a sense of some of this, the polycentricity, and some of the examples of where they're working, because those examples are often quite hidden and under the surface. You know, it's the big things that the media love and the simplistic, and the polycentricity is more complex. And I suspect that's where where our answers will come, because that's how nature keeps its resilience and sustainability. And yeah, that's sort of my point.
Thank you. I think it's a really, really important point. And it's also like a challenge to us academics. I think, Tina, you raised this also in your talk at some point, how to actually interact with the real world and how to give back what we learn to others. Harini is in the policy space, and how to make, and I think we could probably learn from you how you speak to people on the ground and explain what polycentricity means, maybe without even such a mouthful of a word, which is difficult to grasp as such. But I'm just looking at the time, and we are actually out of our session's time limit. It's 6:45, so I don't want to hold people much longer, especially people who are in time zones where this is getting a little bit late.
Can I just say one sentence in the very quick response to Massimo? Because I think it's a really important point, and I think whenever you see environmental challenges, especially often in global south context, but also in the US, for instance, what people are asking for is a challenge. So the world is breaking down because of polycentricity. Crudely said, you know, there are too many actors pulling in different directions, and what we need is a strong hand. Mm-hmm. And therefore you get the typical strong, usually a man, but often yes, a strong leader, and that one leader or one centralized system is supposed to give the answers to everything, and it doesn't. So I think you're absolutely right, Massimo. We need to educate people or talk more about why you need polycentric solutions.
Yeah. Okay. So, well, thank you. First of all, thank you very much to all our 3 wonderful keynote speakers, and also for your willingness to come back to this final session. There is a network session afterwards, but I might not have the kind of audience. I also wanted to thank Massimo. I want to thank David Gindes, Francesca Gagliardi, and all the other council members, including Nadia and Georgina and others that I'm now missing. But they have done a lot of legwork to make this work. I'm the president of this organization, but as I like to say, it's like the German presidency is more a figurehead than anything else. And I feel very privileged to have been able to run this show in particular. But I want to thank the organizers behind the scenes for making this all work. And I hope to see many of you in the networking so we can share a little bit more about the wonderful event that we have just closed. So thanks to all.
Thank you all.
See you soon. Bye.